et des graves inondations. Ils mènent des opérations de recherche et sauvetage pour venir en aide et des Canadiens en détresse, assurent les services dans une région couvrant plusieurs millions de kilomètres carrés. Ils veillent à protéger notre souveraineté et effectuent des patrouilles de routine et de menant des opérations d'affirmation de la souveraineté telles que l'opération Nanook qui se déroule en ce moment même dans nos territoires arctiques. De plus, dans le cadre de NORAD, ils collaboreront avec nos alliés américains à la défense de l'Amérique du Nord en surveillant nos approches aériennes et maritimes communes et en accomplissant des patrouilles aériennes. Ladies and gentlemen, as Minister of National Defence, and like most Canadians, I'm extremely proud of the Canadian Forces and their families and the work that they do, the important work they do for all of us around the globe. In Afghanistan, as Minister Nicholson mentioned, after 10 years of combat operations, they are transitioning to the NATO-led training mission that will continue efforts to train Afghan national security forces and bring lasting peace and security to Afghans. In the Mediterranean, our CF-18 fighters, maritime patrol aircraft, aerial refueling craft, and the HMCS Charlottetown, soon to be relieved by HMCS Vancouver, are supporting international efforts to protect Libyan citizens by enforcing the no-fly zone and the maritime blockade. And just last week, I had the pleasure to announce that 3 Griffin helicopters and 5 search and rescue teams based out of CFB Trenton were headed to Jamaica at the request of the Jamaican government to assist the Jamaican Defense Forces with any emergency situations that would arise in the next few months while their aircraft are in repair as a result of the hurricane season. Ladies and gentlemen, as these operations and each of the 15 other operations going on around the world, the Canadian Forces are defending our values, supporting those in need, and helping our friends when they call. And they do so with great professionalism, with great dedication, and great courage. Our soldiers, sailors, air personnel, and our special forces play a fundamental role in defending Canada and Canadian interests. And our government remains committed to supporting and recognizing their incredible work. That includes preserving the proud traditions and the history of the Canadian Forces. In 1968, the government of the day passed the Canadian Forces Reorganization Act, which unified the Royal Canadian Navy, Canadian Army, and Canadian Air Force into a single service, the Canadian Forces. As a result, 3 formerly separate entities became 3 elements of a single institution and were renamed Maritime Command, Land Force Command, and Air Command. Our Conservative government believes that an important element of the Canadian military heritage was lost when these 3 former services were required to relinquish their historic titles. Today, I am honored to announce that the 3 elements of the Canadian Forces will have their historic names restored. Maritime Command will now be known as the Royal Canadian Navy. Land Force Command will be the Canadian Army, and Air Command will be the Royal Canadian Air Force. Je suis aujourd'hui très honoré d'annoncer que les 3 éléments des forces canadiennes auront leur nom historique reconstitué. This change is long overdue. Restoring these historic identities is a way of reconnecting today's men and women in uniform with the proud history and traditions that they carry with them as members of the Canadian Armed Forces. Sometimes I think it's important to correct historic mistakes and correct them when possible. After all, it was under these names that the Royal Canadian Navy, the Canadian Army, and the Royal Canadian Air Force brought Canadians great honor. They fought and died in conflicts from the fields of Europe, the beaches of Normandy, the Battle of Britain, and the Battle of Cap Yon, and now in the dusty fields of Afghanistan. And these are the names under which our men and women in uniform contributed to the defense of Europe and North America during the early days of the Cold War. These historic titles will also align Canada with other key Commonwealth countries whose militaries continue to use the Royal designation. The proud legacy of the Royal Canadian Navy and the Royal Canadian Air Force and the Canadian Army will once again serve as a timeless link between our veterans and serving soldiers, sailors, and air personnel. Equally important, these historic names are the way that many members of the Canadian public today still refer to Canada's naval, land, and air forces. I know that in my many visits aboard Her Majesty's Canadian Navy ships, to Army bases, to Air Force wings, the men and women of the Canadian Forces do not refer to themselves as belonging to Maritime Command, Land Forces Command, or Air Command. And I want to thank the thousands of Canadians, among them many veterans, serving members of the Canadian Forces and their families, and parliamentarians who have voiced their support for restoring the historic identities of the Canadian Forces. Among them, if you will permit me, I want to single out and salute two individuals who were able to join us here this morning. Michael Smith, a retired sailor, RMC graduate who spearheaded a campaign to restore the royal designations that gained the support of thousands of Canadians who signed petitions. And Senator Joe Day, who himself is a former member of the Royal Canadian Air Force and has been a vocal proponent and supporter of these measures. Thank you both for your efforts and your presence here today. And just on a practical note, I want to state that the restoring of the historic identities to the Canadian Forces is being done in a phased-in process that will have zero impact on our operational capabilities, which I know is the primary concern of our serving members in our command, and will have minimal cost implications. La remise en vigueur des noms historiques fait partie intégrée de l'engagement du gouvernement qui consiste à reconnaître l'histoire glorieuse du Canada, à célébrer notre patrimoine et à honorer la mémoire de tant des braves Canadiens qui se sont sacrifiés au service de notre pays. Cette initiative fait suite à d'autres, notamment les célébrations organisées à l'occasion du centenaire de la marine et de le rétablissement de la boucle d'officiers à l'intention des officiers supérieurs de la marine. En outre, nous continuerons l'année prochaine de mettre en valeur l'historique national de l'héritage militaire du Canada, alors que nous préparerons les célébrations du bicentenaire de la guerre de 1812. Ladies and gentlemen, we as Canadians are truly blessed with a proud military history, a legacy of service, of sacrifice that established on these shores a land of freedom, democracy, justice, and the rule of law. But a country that forgets its history does so at its own peril. Exactly 100 years ago today, our current Queen Elizabeth's grandfather signed into existence the Royal Canadian Navy. It was an extremely proud and defining moment for our young country. Joined by their comrades in the Canadian Army and later by the Royal Canadian Air Force, these brave souls went on to achieve tremendous things in the course of doing their duty for our young nation. Not only did they defend our shores from those with hostile intent, but they also forged a country, an independent country, a country that has grown to stand tall on the world stage, a defender of freedom and democracy and justice, a country that is, a century later, the envy of the free world. I want to, before I conclude, thank Pipe Major Smith and the Stadacona Band, who I think have added enormously to the ceremony today. And ladies and gentlemen, this is a legacy of which all Canadians can be justly proud. New Canadians, Canadians whose roots go back to the very beginnings of Canada, this is a legacy that today's announcement will help preserve for the generations of brave men and women who will serve this country with distinction for many years to come. I thank you for your presence here. Merci beaucoup.